Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra.
I don't understand. Do you speak another language?
Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra. Shaka when the walls fell.
What in the world was that all about? You're going to find out. Now, some of you may have recognized a bit of that dialogue as something from an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and you would be correct in recognizing that. We're going to talk a little bit about Star Trek, but really more about languages today. But because of Star Trek and, hey, I don't know, a little science fiction-y, felt like something kind of neat like the Black Falcon would be appropriate for that. So, as always, let's get this guy lit. Let's get to talking. You may recall that in the 1990s, there was another Star Trek series called Star Trek: The Next Generation, featuring Patrick Stewart as Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Starship Enterprise. And in a very well-known episode called Darmok, Captain Picard is transported down to the surface of a planet. He encounters an alien life form, and they try to communicate. And it becomes readily apparent that they're going to have difficulties. Because while the other being is speaking words that kind of sound like English, it's very clear that he's speaking in some sort of metaphor. And he says things like Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, or Darmok and Jalad on the ocean. He'll say Temba, his arms wide. And then when he gets frustrated, he'll say Shaka, when the walls fell. Eventually, Captain Picard realizes he's talking in some sort of metaphor and that it may be coming from the mythopoetic literature of his culture. And so then Captain Picard begins speaking in references to Gilgamesh, the great epic poem Gilgamesh. Now, one of the things it just reveals is not just the difficulty of understanding different languages, but as many people have noted, and I used to talk about this, I used to show this episode with some students when I was teaching a class called Critical Thinking and then a class called Theory of Knowledge. Actually, for the other being to have been able to travel in space, and at some point you see their spaceship and the other beings on board their spaceship, if their whole language was based on such rich poetic metaphor, it wouldn't have been a language capable of the kinds of scientific and technological development necessary for interplanetary travel. And so we want to talk a little bit today about why why some languages are better than others. And you say, whoa, now that sounds kind of offensive. How are you going to say one language is better than another? Some languages are, and I'm going to tell you why. There's a wonderful, wonderful book read years ago, and I don't have it here with me at home. I've got it at my school where I teach, called Proust and the Squid. And it's by Marianne Wolfe. At the time, she was a cognitive neuroscientist at Tufts University. I think she's somewhere else now. And she talks early on in the book about this. And she uses as an example why ancient Greek was really a more powerful language than Egyptian hieroglyphics. When you have a pictographic language, like the hieroglyphics, there is a limited amount of what you're able to express. There's a limited range of things that you can actually say with pictures. Now, I know they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, but that's actually not quite true. What Marianne Wolf points out, rightly, is that Greek was an atomic language. And I'm not sure she actually uses that phrase or not. I use it. And maybe she does. But Greek is an atomic language in that rather than made up of pictures, all right, it's made up of atoms. The atoms are letters. Letters that can then be recombined in an infinite variety, an infinite number of lengths of things that then can create words that themselves can be combined and recombined in an infinite variety and an infinite lengths of sentences, and sentences that then can be combined in infinite lengths as paragraphs and so forth. And because the basis of meaning is not in a static picture, but is rather in the arrangements of these linguistic atoms, if you will, letters and words, the power of the language is enormous. Suddenly you can talk about anything that the mind desires, because you can create new words and you can build off of other words and you can rearrange words and the descriptive power of the language is just extraordinary. In fact, really, you could say limitless or nearly limitless. So in that regard, really, Greek is certainly a more powerful language than hieroglyphics, and in some ways is better. Now, you may say the hieroglyphics would be better for some things, and perhaps that is true. But in other areas, Greek is better. So then comes along Latin. And one of the things that Latin has like Greek is obviously letters, alphabet, combine the letters in different ways, make different words make different sentences, and so forth. So Latin is also an atomic language, if you will, just like English and many of the languages that we know today. Now, one of the faults, though, of Latin, and this is hard for me to say, all right, you all know that I'm a Latin teacher, so I don't like to admit that there's anything wrong with my beloved Latin, but there is. There are some weaknesses, and there are weaknesses in all languages. Latin lacks definite and indefinite articles. And you're saying, I don't quite remember my middle school English there, Steve. Can you refresh me on indefinite and definite articles? Indefinite articles are words like a and an. I bought a pipe. I bought an apple. Okay. The definite article in English is the. I bought the pipe lighter. Okay. Latin lacks those entirely. Now, ancient Greek did have the definite article. So something that could point out a word and would be similar to our word the. Greek really didn't do the a and the an thing. And Latin didn't have either. Now, in this regard, English is more powerful than Latin. Think about the difference, okay? A girl was walking down the street. The girl was walking down the street. Entirely different sentences, right? The one is very vague. That's why we say an indefinite article. A girl. Don't know who she was. Don't know where she came from. Don't know what grade in school she was. What? She's a girl. If you say the girl, then there's some more specific reference there. All right, you're indicating a girl that maybe we talked about before. Maybe we've been talking about, there were a bunch of boys and one girl, and they were playing in the yard, and you've known that her name is Sally, and she brought her dog over to play with the boys, and then you say the girl was walking down the street. We know exactly who you're talking about. Right, we're talking about Sally. So a and the, those are important little words, and Latin lacks them, actually. Which is why when we talk about translations, sometimes you don't know. What did an ancient author mean? If I've got a sentence like that in Latin, say, puella per viam ambulat, I really don't know if that means a girl walks through the street or the girl walks through the street. Now, chances are, if it's part of a story or a poem, I'm going to have more context clues. But I'm going to have to put one of those words in English in order to make it make sense. Because if I just translate and say, girl walks through street, that sounds awkward, right? So I've got to put those little words in, even though they are not in the Latin, in order for it to make sense in the English. So I'm going to have to rely on other clues or just my own interpretation. So I want to ask you for a moment, your experience with other languages. First off, have you ever considered the fact that different languages have different power or strength in being able to express ideas? That in fact, some languages may be better than others at expressing certain ideas. Because again, all I can say, I can only communicate to you and say, Achilles and Hector at Troy. How am I going to be able to start talking about liquid and fuel and flints and a striker and how do I have the technical vocabulary to talk about even a device as simple as a pipe lighter if all I have is poetic language? You ever thought about that before? Oh, here's a fun one. Did you ever see that episode of Star Trek? It's called Darmok, capital D-A-R-M-O-K. That's the episode. Did you ever see that? Do you remember that episode? Talk to us about any other languages that you know. And whether you studied them for a little bit back in school or you are really fluent with them today, doesn't matter. If you've got any experience with any other language, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. What do you like about that language that you have some knowledge of? What do you dislike about it? Do you find it particularly good at conveying certain ideas, capturing certain notions and thoughts? Well, you know this is a fun episode for me because I love languages. So, we'll draw it to a close with this. And you know what I'm going to say. As Malcolm Guite likes to say, I do these little things in order at last to do nothing. Or as I like to say in Latin, Parva ago ut tandem. Nihil agam. Have a wonderful day.